welcome everyone. Good evening, good morning, wherever you are. So we are holding this session with our wonderful colleagues and speakers and with everyone today. So our session title would be People's Recovery or Austerity, Alternatives for a People-Centered and Southern-Led Recovery. So I will try to set this scene a bit first, then I will introduce everyone with our wonderful speakers, and then we will open the floor for the discussion. So the COVID-19 pandemic saw a historic rollback of women's rights and rising gender inequality as a result of government inaction in allocating an inadequate amount of COVID-19 recovery funds to social protection, the care economy, and in addressing gender inequalities. A large share of the COVID-19 funds during the pandemic went to corporates, at least 38% of the funds that could be measured, while only 40% went to the informal sector, which is majority female in terms of employment. Social protection received 38% of the total amount funds, helping to some extent for the short duration of 2020 and early 2021 to protect women against the worst aspects of the pandemic. However, by 2023, we are seeing a wave of austerity that is reducing the available funds to be spent on recovery in the global south, let alone addressing the food and energy crisis or imagining a green and just transition in terms of addressing climate change. By 2023, 83 countries will be rolled back government spending below pre-pandemic levels, with as many of 64 countries poised to introduce aggressive fiscal consolidation measures. This impending wave of austerity, where 85% of the world's population will be living under austerity.
For the translate.
Sorry. I'm slowing down for the translation and taking a bit of time. This impending wave of austerity, where 85% of the world's population will be living under austerity measures, in aggravating poverty and intersecting inequalities everywhere, entrenching human rights and development reversals experienced as a result of simultaneous pandemic, war, climate, and cost of living crises. This makes advocacy for tax justice and as an alternative to austerity more urgent than ever before. From this call for the introduction of excess profit and wealth taxes to the demands for structural reform of the global tax architecture and more progressive, equitable, and responsive domestic tax system, and ending harmful tax exemptions that drain public finances and contributed to the corporate recovery during COVID-19. So today's discussion, we are aiming to create a space to take a stock to the regression in terms of women's rights and gender justice during the pandemic, and to propose alternatives. We will be hearing from our amazing speakers to highlight the ways in which tax justice agenda can be articulated into a broader push back against austerity from a green and just recovery. In the light of this background, I would like to introduce our panel today. So let me introduce me first. So I'm Omen Ahida. I'm with Christian Aid, and I'll be moderating this session today. So with us, we have Clelia Guerrero Gracia. She's from Tax Justice. She's from Latin American Network for Social and Economic Justice, LatinDet. She is a tax justice specialist. She is Ecuadorian and has a master's in economics from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her experience involves position in the public service, the academy, and with NGOs, all of them focused on revising the paradigms that guide social and productive interactions and mobilizing to break them when necessary. Welcome, Clelia. And we have Sophie Efange with us. Sophie is the head of policy at the Gender and Development Network, GADEN, a UK-based membership organization working to center gender equality and women's rights within international development policy and practice. Sophie manages GADEN's Reframing the Feminist Macro-Level Economics project, which seeks to shift the way economic policy is framed in international debates and works to create space for Southern feminist expertise and analyze to be heard and prioritized. Sophie is a Black feminist of Ethiopian and Cameroonian heritage. We have with us Sarah Faruqi. Sarah Faruqi co-leads the financial transparency work at the Center for Budget and Government Accountability, New Delhi, and engages closely with the Financial Transparency Coalition. She has worked across think tanks, civil society organizations, and the media in India in different capacities. Sarah comes with experience in diverse aspects of policy research and advocacy, and holds a Master's of Public Policy from the University of Oxford, where she was a Chevening scholar. And last but not the least, we have Frederica Stubb with us, and she's with Bretton Woods Projects. Welcome everyone again, and welcome to the discussion. So as I have shared earlier, in the light of that discussion and background, I'd like to invite Clelia first to help us to understand a bit about the gender inequality aspects of LAC region. So I would like to ask her to speak about the impact of, impact of the COVID-19 in gender inequality, and what's the evidence on government expenditure during the pandemic directed us towards, and what we can do to bridge the gap, and what are the continued challenges. So Clelia, the floor is yours. And I think I would ask panelists to connect their cameras and whatever the facilities they needed to speak. So over to you, Clelia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nahia. Just checking that everything works. It is a pleasure to be here. We have been, I think, talking about the COVID pandemic and multiple crises and polite crisis, as we said before, from so many aspects. But it's still, I think, any time that we get to share this in new contexts and with new perspectives, we get a richer view from this. So this is very exciting. So again, I am from Latin America, from Ecuador specifically, and I worked with LatinDat from 2 years ago. And in this occasion, I have been lucky to be part of this project about the how the recovery expenses from the public or the governments in Latin America have done given this context. I would like to start with what happened. So what is the evidence on the government expenditure in our region? So for that, in Latin America, we took 6 countries: Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, Costa Rica, and Argentina. And also there was another chapter within Central America and America specifically, but I'm just centering within this. And it is curious that, as Nahia said, only between 30 or 40% of the expenditure came to social objectives. And when we focus only on gender, according to the UN side, there were more than 1,000 interventions in the region that were somehow gender aligned. But when we check the actual components of these measures, the reality is different, right? And even from the ones that are mapped within this official side, only 15% of the total expenditure were somehow connected to gender mentions. Even we are not going to the practice or the implementation here. And then in terms of gender kind of sensitiveness of some sort, they said there was 40% of the measure had it, but then in our evidence within our study, that was not the case. And we studied these countries that kind of represented more or less 40% of the total measures that the UN was kind of mapping. So it is represented. And then some issues that we have, why or what is our position in this, is that there was super little to no disaggregated data. So that is an issue because we cannot say much, for real, but that is also information. So that is one of the first takeaways that we have. And then there were no actual like gender lens within the design or the implementation, more than the theoretical prioritization of let's do this for moms or for working women or for people working in households that were like specific theoretic prioritizations. The general policy making is not being seen through the gender lens. So I will go further on this later, but it's just not the like in the design or the implementation, the requirements, the tools that make policy or any kind of implementation accessible are not designed for women or for minorities in general, but we're focusing here on women. And then again, going back to the UN official site, just like 15% of the measures kind of aimed economic security, which we know are a big part of not only like surviving, but also in other like social, environmental kind of decisions. But this 15% was mostly like centered in 4 of the 47 countries from our region or from our continent. So again, maybe we see, oh, 15% is not that bad, but they are in 4 countries, mostly. And in terms of care or unpaid care, only 0.2% of the measures, 0.2, like nothing, considered unpaid care, even though care, as we have seen from like latest studies, even in Colombia, for instance, it represents more than 20% of the GDP. Like it contributes to that, like even more than any other productive or economic sector, more than financial sectors, more than agriculture, more than any of those. And even if that is the case, and even if people even could, like women spend probably 40% of their time sometimes of their daily lives doing care, it is not important at all within the recovery measures. But let's move on to what did this imply? So some things that we can take from what I presented before is that there is a vision of aid, of let's do them a favor, instead of let's be responsible with a part of the population that not only needs us, but also contributes to the general development, general well-being. And then it also implied that there was a inefficient use because vulnerable sectors could not be very well targeted because we do not know much about them. And if we do in the design or implementation, as I said, collection conditions, allocation requirements, even like kind of patriarchal design of the measures that impede that the people that needed to access to the benefits could do it. And then in the end, it just translates into a small or minimum actions because we think it's not a priority, like it's not a priority, it's not important, or we cannot do much about it, right? So, but what can, but we haven't been able to do yet. So one of the takeaways that we had in the region was about registries, because if we did have better registers, a bit more actualized, a bit more like interactive with the realities, people that were in like human mobility conditions, for instance, could have been able to access some sort of help, but we don't, or most of the countries don't. So that is something we could work on. Still, there are challenges for that. Another idea is about infrastructure, but not only physical infrastructure, because we know that lots of the gaps that we are seeing now as a result of the pandemic are kind of the accumulated result of not attending structural gaps that have been there forever. And but I'm not only referring to that, but also to knowledge and to systems that enable the results that we expect. And I am giving an example here, and it is about, for instance, we expect people to have environmental conscience, but there are not measures or tools or systems that allow people to have the time and the resources to be able to devote the actions towards that. So, for instance, if I, being a person that cares about my household, do have to work, I have to take care of the kids, I have to be able to, make food and clean and everything. There is no time for me to think about recycling or doing some kind of food compost or anything like that, because there is no time, and no one is recognizing that time and that effort that I have to make for that to happen, right? And finally, and I think this is the most challenging one, is aligning short-term versus long-term goals, because most of the time, the people that are making decisions within the public policy space, they are mostly focused on the results, immediate results. And we need to start building for the future, like long-term, in order to structural issues, structural gaps to be able to be overcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Celia, for this excellent presentation and excellent, I would say, discussion on or making it in a way so we can link how these fiscal policies are so much important to see how the women are living their life. And it's such amazing that you have making this linkage, because tomorrow is the International Women's Day. And if we count since 1914, it's been 109 years we are celebrating this. And still we are talking about we need to give a space, and we need to need a space in the policy where we can talk about women, and it should be need some gender lenses there to think about the woman and all the stuff. So yeah, it's really amazing, and thanks for setting the scene in the LAC region and giving the examples of the COVID measures and all. Now I would like to move on to our next speaker. So it's Sarah. Sarah will give us a bit of picture on how post-pandemic recovery policy responses have directed to the interlinkages to the gender discussion in India. So Sarah, the floor is yours.
Oh, thanks, Nahida. And let me just check if everything is technically sound. Yeah, okay. So I quickly wanted to just touch a little bit on the consciousness of gender inequality that we're seeing in a post-pandemic context as such, especially in the civil society organization space, through research organization, in academic departments in university, even in mainstream media, where conversations around gender have kind of transcended the traditional discussions that used to be held, especially when you look, for example, when you think of India and gender, what are the usual topics that come to your mind? The first is obviously things like domestic violence or child marriages, or things like autonomy and choice of women, whether in their private lives with respect to their marriages, with respect to choices in whether they want to work, or even their professional lives, where women are mostly, barricaded in agricultural work or non-formal kind of work. Or you're looking at issues such as how do you get women into the formal economy? I mean, these are just the traditional issues or themes that were looked at. And in a post-pandemic context, because you're looking at such a huge, there are so many issues that have emerged. Every single inequality, every single issue that was there before, it's kind of exacerbated. So the interlinkages of all of that bring us back to gender at some level or the other. So even the research, the study, the analysis, the discussions around gender have kind of expanded, which was not the case, say, a couple of years before. So I'll just very quickly touch upon some of those issues and how these conversations are happening at the moment. So the first is obviously through the pandemic, we saw that India had one of the most stringent lockdowns, and that led to a lot of migration that happened almost overnight. So when the lockdown was announced in March 2020, almost within a span of a week, you had all these informal workers who were working in urban cities who had absolutely no way to make a livelihood. And you saw an immediate migration back to their hometown. So buses, trains, people walked from cities to villages, right? So in such a context, what had happened was the labor force participation overall obviously decreased, but the labor force participation for women, and over 2020, you know, when we analyzed the data for the study that we had with the FTC, that data shows how this labor force participation was particularly high for women. Like the number of women who lost their jobs, I'm not even going into the formal sector, I'm just talking about the informal sector. That was it the impact was obviously seen, but I think the undiscovered impact or the unseen impact was even higher than what we can, you know, what we can assess. So for example, like one of the things is that 90% of female workers and 86% of male workers are in the informal sector. So when you have lockdowns, when you have entire industries shut down, and when your urban centers close, the impact that we're seeing in the domestic lives of women, we're not even going into the professional life, that kind of increased. And now you're seeing that a lot of this conversation is leading to the impact of that on the unpaid care work. So from your labor force participation, which dropped, you're seeing that the number of women who were homebound, who were forced to look at domestic chores, and it took a lot for women in India to break barriers and kind of move in even into that informal economy, right? So you're seeing them receding back into the home. They are looking after the children, they are doing the care work, they are doing from things like bringing water from parts of the rural country back into their homes, to cooking, to child rearing, to care work for the family. All of that, we're almost going back a couple of years in this pandemic period. So that's led to a lot of conversation about undomestic care work, even just general, like the number of women who are just back in homes because they lost their jobs, right? So yeah, I mean, I can give some numbers, but maybe I'll come to that later. And the impact of this, again, undomestic care work, women are back in their homes. The other direct impact was, and I'm trying to link it all together, right? The other impact was on education. So while you would assume that everything is online and people are, schools were still continuing, education was happening. So you would assume that, okay, women are now homebound, so they can still access education. But the point is that there is a generation that was struck by the digital divide that happens. Not everyone has access to devices. While India is one of the most connected countries, everybody almost, has a smartphone and all of that. In rural parts of the country, there is still an entire population that does not have devices. And by devices, they might have mobile phones, but those are not mobile phones that are equipped to allow students to access technology that allows them to attend classes for 6 hours a day. Then there are issues with connectivity, and all of that kind of impacted girls disproportionately. And when you go into the data itself, when you go into the digital divide, the number of women who have access to phones is a lot lower than the number of men. And of course, a lot of that is to do with normative issues, where of having a phone or having a device or having technology is also autonomy for women. So there are socio-cultural reasons, there is a lot of normative practices that come into play. So because of that, education is disproportionately impacted. Access to health, access to reproductive rights, access to contraception, access to safe abortions, all of that also gets impacted. So again, you're interlinkaged to the entire world lockdown, but the manner in which it locked down for women in particular, something that a lot of people are now realizing, and the 2 years of the pandemic that kind of highlighted all of that. And yeah, so what has happened and again, I'm very broadly just touching on all of this, which we faced. Almost every section of people in the policy space, people in in academics, people in research organizations, they're realizing that whether you're studying health, whether you're studying climate change, whether you're studying education, everything has a very consequential gender lens to it at this point. Like, you cannot look at gender in silos if you're looking at any other, policy issue or policy development going forward. And that has led to a lot of new research, new awareness. So from the very normative issues of the global south, we are now also looking at more technical, more policy oriented and more tangible issues that affect women, right? Something as simple as women having access to a cell phone, which links directly to their education, which links directly to their participation in the formal economy. So things like that are becoming more evident, and not just in concentrated academic circles or in research circles and things like that. The other thing that we're also seeing is that a lot of civil society organizations, women's self-help groups, grassroots organizations across regions, whether it is in rural parts of the country or in urban centers, these have emerged. And self-help groups were a huge, like they really helped, through the pandemic, through the 2 years of the pandemic, the emergence of communities working with government, of local representatives, of local women-led NGOs, of initiatives, all of that kind of came into the fore. And this awareness is transcending into a lot of the conversations that we're seeing. And yeah, and moving forward, I think the one thing that is most important, and again, our research last year for the COVID tracker that we'd worked on with the FTC was, there is an urgent need for disaggregated, clean, and updated data on all of these issues. Because what happens is, again, we talk about it, they are thematic, they're anecdotal, and a lot of times if we are looking for tangible policy responses, you need tangible data that can kind of. And the problem is not that this data is not available, it's that this data is not captured. So one of the things is that we kind of need to push for creating a space to capture this kind of data through time as we move forward. Yeah, so that is kind of what I had to say on this.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It was really wonderful to listen to you, about the technology and gender inequality that you have connected together. And it's very timely because this CSO theme of 2023 is also the innovation and technology for gender inequality. So it's really important to connect all these issues together to see the fiscal space and also the policy spaces, how we can link our gender discussion, gender inequality, and all the issues that are linked with the policy aspect and gender issues. So thank you so much for that. So now I would like to invite Sophie to give us a bit a scene or a bit explanation to understand the global context of gender inequality in the COVID-19 and also the world that now we are in 2023. So the floor is yours, Sophie. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Sophie Fange from the Gender and Development Network. Thanks very much for having me as part of this discussion. So I've got a few slides, which hopefully all of you will be able to see, but whether or not they'll be helpful is a different question. But I'll share my screen anyway, just for you to have a look. Bear with me a second. So just really, in terms of a broad overview of the things I'm looking to cover, is just generally to talk about the current global overview of where we are in terms of COVID and gender equality issues. Then more specifically talk about the economic impacts of COVID-19 on women's rights and gender equality. And Sarah and Kulia, you've already done a really brilliant job in expressing those issues from various regions and countries across the world. And there is research that we've done as Gatham that seeks to bring to look at these issues from a range of different regions. So we'll look at specifically women's work, the care economy, and economic vulnerability and social protection, as well as intersecting issues of repression and violence. But we've already heard a lot of very helpful context on those issues. And then finally, just what lessons have we learned from COVID-19 for ensuring a just and equitable recovery? And that is just some of our learnings as GADN based on our research. So in terms of looking at the kind of the broader kind of context, sorry, I think I'm on the right slide. Yeah, in terms of looking at the broader context, I think we can all very much say that in 2023, it's, you really be forgiven for believing that, that COVID was over. Looking at the unprecedented levels of global debt that we're experiencing, sky-high levels of inflation, food shortages, conflicts, man-made humanitarian, natural and humanitarian disasters all around the world. But of course, I don't think any of us would say that these issues aren't connected or aren't a direct consequence of a preceding crises, in particular, that being COVID. And as many of you will have noticed and seen from the key stats that others have pulled out and talked about as it relates to gender equality and women's rights, there have been a considerable rollback of hard-won gains on gender equality and women's rights as a result of COVID. And from increased levels of violence against women and girls as a result of lockdowns, limited access to sexual reproductive health and rights services, falls in income, the whole gambit of gender equality and women's rights issues that have been impacted as a result of COVID. But I think it's really interesting to see how COVID single-handedly as one phenomenon has been one of the largest contributors to the wholesale rollback of gender equality and women's rights across the world. And a lot of times, I think when we talk about the concept or the issue of rollback, it's really understood within the frame of aggressive anti-rights actors or rising nationalism or corporate capture, all of those kind of issues, but which are very kind of deliberate and very systematic in the way in which they strip back women's rights. But the undermining of women's economic rights specifically as a result of COVID has had drastic knock-on effects, and many of those have already been spoken about by former speakers, and very much have been the ones that are contributing to the crises that we're experiencing now globally, cost of living crises, as well as inflation, all the rest of the circumstances that we're experiencing at the moment. So broadly speaking, what have been the economic impacts of COVID-19 on gender equality? So as I mentioned, COVID has had obviously devastating impacts on a range of gender equality metrics. However, as part of a paper that we produced as a Gender and Development Network last year on lessons for a feminist COVID economic recovery, we really squared in on the impacts that COVID had on women's economic rights. And we looked at 4 specific case studies across that were pulled together for us by feminists and women's rights organizations in Argentina, the Philippines, India, and Uganda. And despite the varying national contexts, that demonstrated very similar realities for women in pre-COVID contexts, the same kind of issues we saw manifested as a consequence of COVID-19. And as I mentioned before, Sarah and Cornelia have painted those pictures for us to some extent. So moving forward, if I move on to my next slide, if we look at some of these economic impacts, specifically beginning with the issue of women's work, very briefly, we know that women are overwhelmingly overrepresented in the informal economy with very limited access to social protections, to labor rights, and huge disparities in income. And as a result of COVID, we saw that job losses for women were particularly high and across the board from all 4 case studies that we examined. And also relating to the issue of global supply chains, even in formal employment, women's economic security was often less than men's, and especially as a consequence of lockdowns, a lot of garment workers, especially, I think Sarah had mentioned, in India, but also horticulturists in Uganda saw the demands for their work drastically decrease, and massive amounts of job losses across the board on a lot of work that was associated or within global supply chains. And in terms of those who worked in small businesses or who operated small businesses, throughout our case studies, we found that women-led enterprises suffered disproportionately, and with many government interventions overwhelmingly focusing on big businesses rather than protecting the economic needs and rights of women-led businesses and informal sector workers. And then if we move on to the issue of care, which of course I think has been a prevalent one that our speakers have also spoken on quite explicitly, and it goes without saying the issues around unpaid care, massive increases in unpaid care burdens that were experienced by women across the board. And from any kind of research that you uncover as part of your COVID analysis, that is the one particular issue that has resonated so exclusively across a range of contexts. And then with issues of paid work, even where we have seen the continued undervaluing of care work that's paid, even in these contexts where we realize that women are stepping in to provide public services, or where the government has failed to provide any kind of particular provision. We're seeing that in examples like Argentina, in one of our case studies, despite policies that were put in place by the government to provide a variety of different types of provisions, from canteens for food provision or to look after children, etc. Those provisions, those paid care workers, still do not have sufficient resources to address the very specific needs, the huge amounts of demands that came to the fore. And I think it was Lilia who mentioned in her presentation that in Colombia, the amount of the percentage that unpaid care work represents in the economy, I think you mentioned clearly it was 20%. In Argentina, we found that it constituted 16% of the country's total GDP. And even during the pandemic, when so many industries were closing down and dwindling as a result of lockdowns, the care sector grew exponentially despite everything that was happening in Argentina. So, I mean, again, across the board, we see these experiences for women across the 4 case studies that we examine. And then just looking at economic vulnerability and social protections, again, across all our 4 case studies, those women with access to savings, or those who didn't have access to savings or access to credit, experienced massive fallout as a consequence of not having those safety nets to fall back on during these times of crisis. And of course, again, it goes without saying that women's lower income means that they have limited access to social protection measures, social protection schemes across the board again. And this we saw exacerbated as a consequence of COVID, where they weren't able to access vital social protection because of a variety of pre-existing inequalities that existed in many national contexts. So very quickly, just to say that, of course, I've talked about the economic impacts, but there have been other intersecting issues, including the discussions on violence against women and girls, which, again, exceptionally prominent as a consequence of lockdowns, but also critically closing political space as a consequence of COVID, and how governments were using lockdown measures to enact really regressive and draconian policies that limited the organizations' abilities to collectively communicate or express dissent. And again, a huge factor that played up quite explicitly across all our 4 case studies. So what have we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic? So in this paper, which I'm not going to list out for you in detail here, given the time constraints that we have, we'd identified 11 particular lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. And I've listed them here, but you can certainly have a look at the paper. But just some of the key ones that I wanted to flag to you were lesson 2 on policy formulation and design of those policies must address existing and intersecting discriminations that shape the impact of the pandemic on women. So specifically talking about how one-size-fits-all policy measures clearly do not work, and how government interventions themselves in response to COVID, as many have already spoken about, were largely gender blind and failed to address the lived realities for many women. And then the key lesson as well, lesson number 3 here, is that governments must recognize the central role that care, both paid and unpaid, plays in the well-being of society and the functioning of the economy, and take responsibility for its provision, acknowledging that paid and underpaid women should not be responsible for filling gaps. And again, I think for us, this has been one of the key lessons of the pandemic about the central role that care plays in the functioning of all our societies, and how investment in social infrastructure is a fundamental component of being able to build these transformative futures post-COVID. And lesson 5, that decision makers should facilitate the broad participation of stakeholders, community organizations, and feminists as part of policymaking, again, I think speaks to this issue of the lack of participation or exclusion, very deliberate exclusion of women from decision-making spaces that are absolutely critical for building these longer-term transformative futures. And finally, just to pinpoint, given the guise in which we are all gathered here today, lesson 8, which is on macroeconomic policymaking, must address the structural and intersectional roots of gender inequalities. And so I think it's very clear that what the pandemic has highlighted is that previous macroeconomic policymaking was already faulty to begin with, and the real clamor for governments, for policymakers to reinstate policy measures that we had pre-pandemic as a way as part of this recovery fails to recognize or understand that actually this is not the way in which you quote unquote build back better, by reinstating these same kind of regressive tax measures, really horrendous trade and investment regimes that are back to the usual way of operating, and how fundamental it is for us to be able to use this opportunity to rethink how you design macroeconomic policy for the betterment, for the fulfillment of long-term transformative futures. So I'll stop there. And yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you so much for this brilliant presentation, Sophia. I cannot say enough about the way you linked all the connections through like from policy formulations to governments to policymakers and macroeconomy and structural and intersectional roots of gender inequalities, and how you have shared the country examples from Argentina and Colombia. And it's also it's also interconnected with the case studies that we have heard from Sarah, and also Talia has also shared with us. So thank you so much. And last but not the least, I would like to move on to our next speaker now, that is Friederike. Friederike, welcome. And also you have heard like from our other speakers that they have discussed and shared their experience from their research about the gender impact throughout this COVID-19 and because of this pandemic. So can you please tell us a bit about the global context of austerity and the cuts? Because we have already heard about all the impacts. So now we want to know from you about the austerity and the cuts and all the regressive policies that governments have taken across the world. So floor is yours, Friederike.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nahida, and all the brilliant previous speakers. It's always difficult to come last in line after such a distinguished panel. And it was really brilliant, to hear all of your research and data and evidence about how women, are basically, as always, the shock absorbers of crises like the COVID pandemic. And then, also in a way, shock absorbers of the inadequate government policy response. And so I'm here as the gender equality lead of the Bretton Woods Project, but also as a member of the steering committee of the End Austerity campaign, which is a civil society campaign that was brought to life as a result, of course, of very long time mobilizing, but in particular of this COVID situation, because at first, and in the first months of the pandemic, I think we saw a very strong push from leadership in global North countries, but also in institutions like the IMF, really encouraging governments to be forceful in their pandemic responses, and to also spend money on public health as much as needed, from the IMF to provide emergency loans without conditions. And so there was this very strong initial policy response, but then what we are seeing, in the latest IMF loans, but also in the sort of budgets that are coming out of governance now, is a very fast return to cutting down on government expenditure very early on in the process of the pandemic. Already in 2022, this trend was emerging. And so as a result of that, at the time, over 500 civil society organizations and academics came together to write to the IMF and ministries of finance, pushing back against this. And as a result of this letter, now the austerity campaign has been born. So if anyone on this call or watching later is interested also in learning more about the campaign or even joining the struggle, you'd be very welcome. And please do reach out to us, or to I think almost anyone on the panel here. But yeah, to speak a little bit about that. So I think, we have a wealth of research at this point about austerity and the harmful effects of austerity on women in particular. We have really great research from Isabel Ortiz that comes out, every couple of years. The last one just very recently, really giving us a global overview of the austerity numbers and, demonstrating, looking at all of the policies that are in the pipeline, basically, that in particular this year, almost over 80% of the global population are affected by austerity measures. So it's really almost all countries worldwide. And many of them even cutting back their spending below pre-pandemic levels. And of course, we're in a situation, as Sophia said, like those issues are far from gone. Not even the pandemic is gone, but now we have, many other needs still. Economies are still devastated from the results of the pandemic, but also from, the food crisis, the cost of living crisis, climate impacts, etc. So we're definitely not back in, in a time where we can sort of sit back and start saving. And so these cuts are going to have, significant impacts on women, but also really hamper countries' ability for any kind of green or just transition. Building back better from COVID is one step, but, even the huge needs in terms of climate finance and having a, achieving the SDGs going forward is going to be significantly hampered by that. So I just want to, I don't know how much time I have actually, but I just want to mention a few of those austerity measures. We have a website for the campaign that is going to be back online very soon, where, you can also go and look with ideas about things, how you can get involved, etc. But as well as a list of measures to look out for, but they're really manifold. We're looking at things like cutting public services, like education, health, public transportation, etc. Also cutting, the public sector wage bill, which oftentimes means, teachers, nurses, and again, a big gendered impact of that, given that, women are overrepresented in these kind of jobs and overrepresented in the public sector. We'll see, cuts to social protection coverage. And whenever you see the words of, social safety nets being used, that's usually a way of saying moving away from universal social protection coverage to very, very targeted programs, for the very, very poorest, which of course is far from sufficient in a context where we see such universal impacts as the previous speakers have been describing. And then other reforms, that, flexibilize labor and pension and social security, a move towards privatization and things like, reducing subsidies and things like food and fuel, which of course, again, in the context of the current cost of living crisis in many places is going to hit the poorest the most. But of course, is a very difficult context. We're discussing these crises to make an argument that there are alternatives to austerity, because the sort of neoliberal ideology of this is the way to go, and the state budget is like a household budget. If you spend a lot of money, then you got to save a lot of money, is very, very strongly entrenched. And so one of the goal of the austerity campaign is actually to challenge those assertions and do so publicly, and to raise public awareness, and to basically shift the incentives and the sort of context for policymakers to make different decisions. Because as long as there's no public challenge of this sort of ideology and of these very deep rooted ideas, it's going to be difficult for us to really convince policymakers and decision makers to make different decisions. And so again, there is plenty of great civil society research out there. I already mentioned some, but also folks at ActionAid just are publishing papers now on care and austerity and public services, and what well-funded, gender-responsive public services could look like. But also this event, I think, is part of the series of events of the Global Action Days for Tax Justice from the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and in particular under the banner of feminists supporting wealth taxes. And so I do want to bring this topic in, because of course it's such a key part of what are the alternatives to austerity. Like, if there is no money, where is the money going to come from? So increasing progressive taxes is a big topic, and really central, I think, when we are discussing the effects of austerity, and again also with gendered impact. So looking at taxes on corporate profits, on personal wealth and property, on financial activities, or on fossil fuel extraction and windfall profits. All of those aren't just the solution to austerity, but also I think a really key part of the arsenal in fighting against climate change, for example, and fighting for greater transparency. And then other measures such as eliminating illicit financial flows, which, as we know, are draining huge amounts of money from the global south to the global north. Finally, really talking about restructuring debt and debt relief, which was raised earlier, is just a huge issue, and sort of the other side of the coin of the austerity discussion, right? There is no fiscal space for social spending because so much public funding is being diverted to repaying debts. And then I think, one of the key parts of this campaign, and I think also of the bigger picture around the austerity discussion, is who actually gets to make these decisions. And I really like what Sophie already said about, the wider consultation and how these policies are being designed and how they're being decided upon. So it's really important that they move out of the closed doors of the ministries of finance and the IMF and these extremely, very removed elitist technical discussions, to actually having a real national social dialogue around those topics, around the budget, around what do we want to prioritize, in a democratic context. Where do we want our taxes to go? And part of that, could also just be reallocating existing public expenditure. Now there's a big push for military spending as a result of the Ukraine war. So we can see all of a sudden countries like my own Germany, all of a sudden they find, 100 billion in some extra fund that they just created out of the regular budget so that it doesn't show up on their debt sheet. For that. So clearly it's a matter of prioritization, political will. And for that, we need this kind of global mobilization. And I just have to say, I'm very I'm very encouraged by the amazing people and partners that we're already seeing that are doing this work on a ground level, on a national level, on a regional level, and you know, we can take these into the global debates and hopefully move the ball forward. I don't know if this is enough.
you.
How much time I was given. I hope I didn't speak too much or too little.
Thank you so much, Frederica. You have already beautifully and wonderfully painted the picture and made the linkages of all towards the measures and austerity cuts to the alternatives and all the policies and what's the first world is doing. So thank you so much for saying that. And now, and also for mentioning the Global Days of Action Space, better late than never. So it's basically, we are hosting this session under the Global Days of Action, Global Days of Action Week on Tax and Women Rights 2023. So, and it's the 7th edition of this global campaign. And also I'm one of the co-chairs, and apologies for not mentioning that earlier. So we are holding this discussion in a bit informal space. As you can see, many of our brilliant colleagues and members are here. And so I would like to open the space for discussion, general discussion and Q&A if you have any questions to our amazing speakers and also the colleagues we have here. I hope you can see them through the camera, and it's a hybrid session. So please post your answers, questions, any comments and feedbacks in the Q&A option. And also I'd like to request colleagues here, if you want to add anything or speak anything about the topic that we have discussed and listen to our speakers. Sure. Emma Bergiser,
Okay.
Economic Justice Lead of Christianing.
Thank you, Nahida, and thank you to all the speakers that I found that really helpful to help us all sort of focus our minds and you know, review these things that we've been talking about for a long time since the pandemic, but to just bring it all together in this space, I think is really helpful. And I am looking at the screen, so if there are attendees who want to raise their hands or add anything on the chat, please do so. But I did have a few questions, thoughts that the presentations brought up in me that I would love to hear the speakers' thoughts on, but also everybody else here. Clelia, when you were speaking about you know, the number of policy measures that UN Women has been tracking versus the money, right, that is there, it really, the first thing that came to my mind was the human rights standard of maximum available resources, right, which is supposed to be all about the idea that having policy measures for gender equality isn't enough, that they are supposed to come with the resources. And so I wonder whether, I wonder about, I guess, the legal standards that were applied or completely not applied, in this decision-making process. It makes me, it points me out to that standard of maximum available resources, right? And I know that it's a very difficult standard, and that I think more work needs to be done for policymakers, but also for activists like ourselves to actually understand what that obligation actually holds. But I'd be interested in your perspectives on sort of some of the governments you looked at in your research, whether you felt there was any sort of visible, measurable, consideration of these sort of human rights standards in the decision-making, which I know is difficult at best of times, but of course, in the middle of these crises, I imagine, right, they're not there. But yeah, it's something I think for us to think about and where that could point us to in terms of that standard. So that's one question. I'm just gonna do a few, if that's okay. I think for Sophie and Sarah, for me, the stories you shared, I think, tell us a bit about sort of risks and opportunities, right? Or challenges and opportunities. Because on the one hand, Sophie, what you shared, you know, I feel like with everything we already knew before the pandemic, right, about how women engage in the economy, and you know, like how incredibly biased and patriarchal mainstream economic policymaking is, we shouldn't be surprised, right, of the outcomes of the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic and the policy making around that. And you know, Sophie, I saw those recommendations at the end of your presentation, and I just think about the context we're in now, right, and what the actual like challenges or opportunities are to further those, given the extremely difficult context we are still very much in. And in some ways, I feel like those crises are, you know, only accelerating, and not just the crises, but also the sort of broken model, right? The broken decision making. It seems to me like in so many places, decision makers are doubling down on the wrong way of approaching the economy rather than, you know, moving towards our side. So I wonder, sort of, Sophie, where you see those opportunities maybe to poke through that. And then for Sarah, you know, you mentioned, you know, the opportunity, I suppose, of the conversation around gender in India really opening up. But I guess there's the flip side of what are the risks that you see there. And you can both answer either or both, you know, just sort of throwing some ideas out there. And then finally, I mean, Frederica, before you finished speaking, I had jotted down, does this tell us something about feminists for wealth taxes? So yeah, you know, I think you're completely right? I think the environment we're in is telling us we need a lot more resources for all the many more increased needs at a time when all of these resources are being constrained, right? And so I can feel it myself in my job, being asked the question all the time, a lot more, what is our answer to where all of this money is coming from? And if we don't believe the private sector is the answer to all of that, at least, you know, I do think we need to, you know, have that very united and clear voice on what some of those answers are, like wealth taxes. And of course, I don't need to tell the tax justice community that, but I'm incredibly happy to see, you know, that movement in the feminist space, to see the theme of this week, you know, being there, because I think that's exactly the right thing to be doing, is to sort of coalesce around those answers. And of course, it's not just tax, also debt, etc. It's always complex. But yeah, so I'm really happy to see that. And I guess I'm wondering if there are further opportunities that we maybe haven't explored in terms of saying something like a wealth tax is the main outcome, is the main lesson learned of the pandemic, you know, and everything that's gone wrong in it. So I'll leave it there. Lots to mull over. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Emma. So speakers, would you like to take the questions and answers?
Thank you, Emma, for the questions. It is, I think the best part of a conversation is when there is feedback and exchange. So happy to have them. I would start my answer sharing that when I started studying economics, I was shocked at how it got me like just knowledge to back up positions, right? And unfortunately, it means that we can kind of get support for any like perspective that we have on what is happening. And it just, it's the result of us as humans, as citizens, being our realities from our bubbles as well, right? But what I'm trying to do or say with this is that probably in theory, they are like just being or acting according to some standards or some like frameworks like the one you mentioned. But again, what it doesn't necessarily translate into change, into results, into actual benefits for those who need them. And for instance, in Ecuador, it's not necessarily like gender example, but it's something similar. There were some measures super ambitious about helping SMEs. And what happened was that the requirements were so difficult to meet that probably 5% of the beneficiaries of this super big policy that was promoted and applauded even from other countries and international organizations was actually delivered to SMEs. So in theory, that was, you know, a super desirable action, but in practice it was. And that is, I think, what we, of course, frameworks kind of give us guidelines, but there is also the reality that we have in front of us. And I think that is what make our work valuable, because we are not only referring to like figures and results and statistics, but we are like giving stories, like trying to transmit realities into lessons.
Thanks, Celia. Sarah, next it's you. Okay.
Yes.
Thanks.
So I just, can I jump in before you, Sarah, only because I'm about to be kicked out of my meeting room, so I might not be able to speak to you all. But just very quickly in response to Emma's question about the potential opportunities, it was just to say that I think that there is clearly a very, very, very small window since COVID to be able to influence government policy making and decision making on the issues that have been intensified and exacerbated by COVID. And there have been a lot of positive responses from a lot of governments, you know, this rhetoric on build back better, etc., which is now obviously dying a death as a consequence of all these other new emerging, well, they're not new, but they are a consequence of COVID, all these other issues that are emerging. But I would say in terms of some potential positives, for example, tomorrow in the UK here, the UK government is going to release its new Women and Girls strategy. And as part of that strategy, and as a direct response of from a lot of women's rights organizations, movements, etc., for this push to recognize and compensate, fund, resource women's rights organizations and movements, there is a new program that the government is going to launch tomorrow with a multi-million-pound program that will fund and resource women's rights organizations and movements from the UK government. And I do think that that is intimately connected to a lot of the advocacy work that feminists had done in response to COVID, and how we saw women's rights organizations fill a lot of the gaps that had been created by, you know, when the state failed to intervene. And then I just think in terms of just potential, again, opportunities is, or you could see it as a challenge, is that the potential co-option of some of the work that we have been doing by governments, and especially on the issue of care, where there has been a lot of interest amongst, for example, G7 governments, and that's a huge advocacy target for us as the Gender and Development Network. But at the same time, it's how those governments interpret these big, big, big issues of, for example, the need to centralize the care economy, and how they take something as big as that and transpose that to the issue of providing the World Bank's childcare initiative, for example, which is a tiny little contribution to the wider, bigger demands that have been created by COVID. But I think the challenge is that we land up with these really piecemeal offerings instead of wider transformative changes. So it's, I guess it's very slow incremental progress that we're seeing, but it needs to be on a much more, you know, a much larger level in order to deliver the kind of things that we're looking to see. So I just wanted to add that and say to you all, unfortunately I've got to leave, but loved having the conversation with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sophie, for joining. Okay, back to Sarah.
Yeah, okay. No, so your question about the risks, right? So I think one of the good things has been, yes, there's a lot of conversation that's happening, and the best outcome is that people are also looking at the interlinkages. The risk of that is that sometimes the interlinkage to the other issue, those issues can start to dominate the conversations on gender, right?
Yeah.
So for example, while it's excellent and it's important that, you know, when we look at healthcare or when we look at education or when we look at climate change, the gender lens is now applied. But this lens has to continue to remain, like
Yeah.
it in another year, the chances are that it might slide back where gender becomes another box or another thematic area in a report on climate change and not the focal point of view, which is kind of what we want now moving forward from the pandemic recovery. So I think one of the biggest risks and challenges right now is going back to that nonsense.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Federica, would you like to come on in this stage?
Yeah, I'm actually not sure if there was a question in what Emma said, other than what does wealth tax got to do with it? So yeah, I also don't want to ramble on other than saying taxation and austerity are like topics and words that turn off a lot of people. I think if anything, like the general population thinks taxes are boring or tedious at best. And austerity, I think there, like in some places like the UK, there's some understanding of that because there has been also quite good press coverage, and obviously this country has gone through a prolonged phase of austerity, but in other places it's like, what does this even mean? And so I think a big part of our work, in this campaign, but also as a community is also, it's good to have the technical knowledge that, clearly, as sort of mentioned, finally you have the, things to back up your arguments, and also you get taken seriously in conversations with decision makers, etc. So that's definitely required, but also I think there is still like a big disconnect with sort of, wider public understanding around these issues. Maybe with wealth taxes and sort of tax the rich, it's getting there a little more, thanks to people like AOC in the US, etc. But we need to, find a language and a way of communicating these issues that resonate with people. And I think, at the end of the day, what these things are about is very close to home, right? It's about your ability to care for your loved ones. It's about your pension and, your ability to, have a good life, to educate your children, to live in dignity and in fulfillment of your rights. And so, moving to this kind of empathetic language and human language is really important, and to be able to tell these kind of stories. And yeah, just the note on the wealth taxes or the taxation part. I think there is some move around that. Obviously, some countries actually implemented that, like Argentina in the pandemic, to raise funds for their pandemic response. The UK put up, a wealth tax commission in 2020 to investigate whether that's something to pursue. So there is a movement around that. I think, the more data we have in terms of showing, okay, this is how much money could be raised that way. I think that's kind of work that has to be done on a national level, and a lot of it is probably also a transparency issue, but having those numbers to be able to say, okay, if we raise like 1% from people that have, this much money, we could fund all of those things. That can be, really powerful. So, hopefully we'll succeed in that. And at the end of the day, it's also a feminist issue because, of course, looking at, the richest people in the world, most of them are men. Most of the, richest corporations in the world are run by men. Most of the wealth and capital and assets and land of the world is owned by men, etc. So, is also a redistributive issue that has a gendered aspect to it, not just a sort of class aspect.
Thank you so much, Frederica, for making this connection with the tax, wealth tax, and the redistributive aspects. And also, talking a bit about making it more relevant with the everyday life and also the language that we use for the tax justice and for the wealth tax. But I think it's okay. Let's make big mans unhappy, by this global campaign. So thank you so much, everyone. But before we finish this session, I would like to invite everyone to visit the Global Alliance for Tax Justice website to look at all the programs that we have for throughout these 2 weeks from that we have started from yesterday to 17th March. And tomorrow is the International Women's Day. And we have the photo actions and Twitter actions for that day, especially. And there are lots of interesting discussion will be around on these tax justice issues. And there will be so many more case studies about different countries on tax issues and women rights and human rights and all the stuff. Please keep an eye on that, join the session. And thank you so much, everyone, for being with us and listening to us. Thank you.
Thanks, ladies.
Thanks, Frederica.